Have you ever heard that old saying about video game controllers? You literally can't play video games without them. There's so many controllers out there nowadays, and I happen to own most of the major first-party controllers from the last decade and a half. I wanted to tell you about each controller and my feelings towards them, and of course, which one I consider to be the best. Let's start with the classics. Oh god, these are considered classics. The Xbox 360 controller is one of my personal favorite controllers of all time. As someone who grew up loving Nintendo controllers, such as the GameCube, the Xbox 360 controller fits my hand like a glove. Still to this day, the grips are the perfect width and very curved in design, not feeling too stiff or too bulky. It rests in my hands really naturally. The triggers are thin enough and there's this really satisfying feeling to pressing them down. And this may seem a bit controversial, but I really like the D-pad of the 360 controller. I'm a Sega man personally, so the Genesis controller was my bread and butter. I just feel like the circular D-pads are a bit more flexible and natural for my giant clumsy thumbs. Still to this day, it rests in my hands very naturally and those juicy, colorful buttons warm my heart. It's a controller that had style to it. The convex Xbox logo, the colors of the buttons, the early 2000s cool factor it had. The Xbox 360 controller is timeless to me and will always be up on a pedestal. What won't be up on a pedestal is the DualShock 3 controller for the PlayStation 3. I certainly think this controller is fine for PS2 era games and the Japanese games that were prominent on the PS3, but for a majority of my time with this controller over the last decade and a half, it has never felt comfortable. Shooters, first-person and third-person games, racers, action games, and more, this thing has always cramped my hands up, and the way Sony just smushed the joysticks together would have my thumbs constantly scraping into each other, and my thumbs would feel stressed from how stretched they had to be to reach the center of the controller where those joysticks were smushed. The worst part was, due to how awful the triggers were for this thing, feeling more like car brakes than triggers, most shooters on the PS3 had you using the bumpers for primary attacks. PS3 ports did sometimes give you the option to switch to using those awful triggers, but why would you when they're this unsatisfying to use? It has its uses for certain types of games, but during the 360 era of consoles, this controller just wasn't for me. It was just this uncomfortable mess that Sony was wise to move away from. Which brings us to the DualShock 4, which interestingly is one of my favorite controllers of all time. This thing feels like Sony took a step back, looked at their PS3 disaster and the cramped thumbs it gave players, and then looked at what made the Xbox 360 controller so damn comfortable, and used as many notes as possible from that when designing their primary PS4 input device. For one, it's much wider than the DualShock 3, so my thumbs actually have room to breathe. They swapped out those ugly convex sticks for some Xbox 360 inspired sticks, and the triggers have been redone to feel more like a compromise between the classic paddles of the PS3 controller and the Xbox 360 triggers. And you know what? The DualShock 4 controller works. It works really well. It's really damn comfortable as a bit of hardware, and it feels like what I'd envision a next-gen PlayStation controller to feel like. And thanks to programs like DS Windows, the PS4 controller can be used quite comfortably on PC in most titles, and it's my go-to controller when I game on the PC. Isn't that funny? Now, this unfortunately brings me to the Xbox One controller. You ever heard the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Well, that's sort of always been my experience with the Xbox One controller. I remember when I first held one back in 2013, it didn't feel quite right. It was a bit too fat. It was too strict, and the way Microsoft got rid of all the dips and grooves of the 360 controller meant this thing never really rested in my hands naturally. It's way less round, it's a lot more angular, and it's hard to wrap my fingers around it comfortably. The simple triggers were replaced with these weird paddle-like things that never felt satisfying to press in like the good old 360 triggers. And the sticks were just so weirdly thin and twitchy. There's like no resistance on them, and my thumb is way too large for them, which just ends up making my thumbs cramped after extended play sessions. And I hate the way Microsoft made the buttons, sticks, and D-pad sort of sink into the surface of the controller, whereas the buttons and D-pad and sticks were a bit elevated on the 360 controller. It made pressing them and using them feel a lot nicer. I just really dislike the Xbox One controller. The fixes that Microsoft made to the 360 controller design just ended up making this thing really uncomfortable to hold for me, and that's part of why I prefer using the PS4 controller when I play on my PC. It ironically feels a bit more in the spirit of the 360 controller's comfortable design. So imagine my disappointment when the Xbox Series X was revealed and Microsoft was sticking with this clunker. Now, before you call me a Sony shill, let me just tell you that I also got my hands on the new DualSense 5 controller for the PS5. And Sony made some of the same choices that pushed me away from the Xbox One controller. The PS5 controller is just really not as comfortable as the PS4 one. Sort of like how the PS4 controller copied the Xbox 360's homework, it feels like the PS5 unfortunately copied the Xbox One's homework. For starters, Sony also adopted the more stiff, less rounded grip style, making it less comfortable to wrap my fingers around. Sony also took baby steps towards syncing the buttons and sticks into the controller's body, and they also ditched a bit of history that I rather actually liked about Sony's controllers. PlayStation controllers typically had these plastic flat buttons with the symbols being brightly painted and colored. Now, the color, fun, and charm of those iconic PlayStation buttons have been sanded away, becoming generic, colorless, with no life or style to them. Even the triggers on the back of the controller are starting to get a bit fatter and wider, mirroring the Xbox One's triggers and drifting a bit too close to those PS3 style triggers. I don't know, man. It's heavier, it's bulkier, and it's just less enjoyable to hold. And the way that Sony has arbitrarily locked down your ability to play the PS5 with the PS4 controller just puts a bad taste in my mouth. Let us use whatever controller we want, man. What is this? This then brings me to the weirdest of the bunch, an outlier, the Switch Pro controller. Something I really admire about Nintendo is their primary devices are typically experimental in nature. The experiment doesn't always work, and if that's the case, there's always a variety of alternatives to choose from, some supported by Nintendo, other times third-party. If the Switch's Joy-Cons aren't to your liking, then they certainly aren't to mine. The Switch Pro controller is a fantastic little device. If you've ever held an Xbox-style controller, the Switch Pro controller will feel instantly familiar, but with a pretty key difference. The X and A button positions are swapped with the Y and B positions, which can really mess you up if you're playing games that have muscle memory built in. Another downside is the lack of analog triggers. Yeah, the triggers on this Switch Pro controller are just flat buttons, which can be quite nice for responsiveness in shooters, but once hopping into a vehicle, you have very little control over the acceleration, or in the case of games like Halo, control over a vehicle's boost strength. I'm really happy that Nintendo resisted the urge, though, to make the controller large, bulky, and chunky like the DualSense 5 and Xbox One controllers, and while I think the Wii U Pro controller was maybe a bit more comfy to hold, the much better button and analog positions make the Pro controller for the Switch an excellent pickup. This thing is solid, especially if you're playing platforming games. Now, which controller is my favorite out of all these? I'd encourage you all to leave your favorites down below, but I think I gave my hand away. My favorite controller has to go to the Xbox 360 controller. As I said before, this thing just feels, I don't know, molded for my hands. I've got relatively long fingers, so the curvature, dips, and grooves on the 360 controller make it the perfect size, weight, and shape for my gamer mitts. The juicy colored buttons on it bring it to life, and it makes it feel less like a bland, sterilized corporate piece of hardware. And the joystick size is just perfect for my oversized thumbs. The triggers are small, thin, and feel great to press down, and that Genesis-style D-pad is the perfect fit for a lazy man such as myself to just roll my thumb around on. Microsoft recently released an original Duke-style controller for the Xbox Series X and Xbox One, and it's such a huge shame that they also seem comfortable re-releasing the same uncomfortable, oversized Xbox One controller over and over again without throwing a nostalgia bone towards fans of the 360 controller. I'd pay handsomely for an official Xbox 360 controller throwback for the Xbox Series X, and it would honestly make me enjoy the Xbox Series X a great deal more. It's a genuinely fantastic upgrade over the Xbox One, with a great backwards compatibility system, auto HDR experiences, and other gaming features. The only issue I have with the console is the controller. but that's just one man's thoughts. What's your favorite controller from the last 15 years of gaming? It can be an official or off-brand controller, and I'm also up for suggestions on good off-brand controllers. I think I'm going to do a follow-up video on off-brand controllers and my personal favorites, so I'd love some suggestions. Of course, a huge thank you to the members of the channel who will appear on the screen right now, and a huge thank you to the patrons over on Patreon who pay $10 or more each month. Patrons such as Blake the Derg, Halagaz Haunted, Wolfric Productions, Hounds of Meath, Vereneth, Brendan Lowry, and Savart Farmer. You guys are absolutely awesome. Thank you all for the engagements over on the Patreon, and check it out if you want to become a member yourself. And yes, I will read out all names for those who pledge $10 or more, even if the name is a bit silly. With that being said, I'll leave you guys to it, and I'll see you on the next video.